Hey, remember the old Batman TV series? There was Bruce Wayne and his ward Dick Grayson, plus Alfred the Butler, all living in stately Wayne Manor. There was also Aunt Harriet, who spent most of her time worrying about Bruce and Dick. But do you know why there was an Aunt Harriet in the first place? Because the creators of Batman were concerned that the relationship between Bruce and Dick, and by extension Batman and the Boy Wonder, was too, it was too gay. A woman was brought into the mix to, straighten things out a bit. Contrast that notion with the law that was passed in France in late 2004. The French Parliament adopted legislation that could get a person 1 year in jail for insulting homosexuals. This law treats anti-gay and sexist comments in the same way other laws treat racist and anti-Semitic insults. Say something homophobic in France, and you could end up with 12 months in the clink, plus the equivalent of a $75,000 fine. Tolerance and acceptance of gay people has certainly come a very long way, hasn't it? And among the many reasons for this is the role played by music, specifically rock music. And if you want to get right down to it, alternative music. Almost from the very beginning, alt-rock has not only pushed for acceptance of gay people, but has also raised awareness of everything from AIDS and various types of discrimination to the contributions gay people have made not to just music, but to all the arts. What do you mean you don't believe me? Well, then you need to stick around. This is Gay New Rock, Part 2.
Now, the ongoing history of new music.
Many colors in the homo rainbow. Don't be afraid to let your colors shine. Many colors in the homo rainbow. Show me yours, I'm gonna show you mine. If you find your pot of gold, then every little thing is gonna work out fine in the homo rainbow. Many colors in the homo rainbow. Pick any shade from black to yellow. Many colors in the homo rainbow. A warm embrace and a kind of hello. If you find your pot of gold, then every little thing is gonna work out fine in the homo rainbow.
And there's Ween with The Rainbow, a 1998 track that was a pretty decent introduction to Part 2 of this program on new rock that just happens to be made by gay people. I'm Alan Cross, and on the first half of the show, we went back to the 60s, 70s, and early 80s to look at how punk and new wave made it easier and safer for people to come out. Now, to be fair, mainstream rock was also part of the plan, although no one really wanted to talk about it, even when things were so obvious. I mean, why, for example, did Freddie Mercury insist that his band be called Queen? Anybody? And look at Judas Priest. I mean, no one wanted to admit it, but singer Rob Halford's interest in leather was more than just a fashion statement. Back then, to come out was to commit career suicide for a mainstream rocker. So for the next 20 years, it was left mainly to punks and new wavers and alt-rock types and the disco crowd to fly that rainbow flag, or at least hint at it. Some, like Tom Robinson and Frankie Goes to Hollywood, were genuinely gay or bisexual. Some, like David Bowie and Lou Reed and the early incarnations of Depeche Mode, adopted feminine images, complete with the makeup and the clothes, as a way to shock and grab attention. And then there were those who were very straight but pro-gay and anti-homophobic. Kurt Cobain and Nirvana fall squarely into that group. Along the way, there were some landmark recordings that helped heighten the straight world's awareness of that alternate sexual universe that was right next door. On Part 1, we talked about the contributions and the influences and the sacrifices made by a number of gay performers, not only in the name of tolerance and acceptance, but also in the ways that they helped move alternative rock forward. These people have been key in our music's evolution and development. We looked at David Bowie, and we looked at Lou Reed. We checked in with a few performers who used the freedom of punk to come at rock from a gay perspective. We covered Relax from Frankie Goes to Hollywood and their very in-your-face debut album, Welcome to the Pleasure Dome. We also covered the homosexual imagery that came with a lot of records by the Smiths, one of the most important alt-rock bands of all time. And now we're going to go deeper into the 1980s to see what other contributions gay musicians have made. Soft Cell was a two-man outfit consisting of Dave Ball and Mark Almond. Mark, the singer, had a very delicate and effeminate image. Yes, he's gay, but back when this song came out, you didn't speak in those terms in public. Those who knew, well, they just, knew, right?
Sometimes I feel I've got to run away. I've got to get away from the pain you drive into the heart of me. The love we share seems to go nowhere, and I've lost my light, for I toss and turn, I can't sleep at night. Once I ran to you, now I run from you. This tainted love you've given, I give you all a boy could give you. Take my tears and that's not nearly all. Tainted love, tainted love. Now I know I've got to run away. I've got to get away. You don't really want any more from me to make things right. You need someone to hold you tight, and you think love is to pray, but I'm sorry, I don't pray that way. Once I ran to you, now I run from you. This tainted love you've given, I give you all a boy could give you. Take my tears and that's not nearly all. Tainted love, tainted love. Don't touch me, please, I cannot stand the way you tease. I love you though you hurt me so. Now I'm gonna pack my things and go. Tainted love, tainted love, tainted love, tainted love. Touch me, baby, tainted love. Touch me, baby, tainted love. Tainted love. Tainted love. Tainted love.
Soft Cell and Tainted Love, a song which not only became a gay anthem, but a #1 single on 4 different occasions. One of the most powerful gay recordings of the 80s was a single by an English group called Bronski Beat. At the center of this band was a gay man from Scotland named Jimmy Somerville. And in 1984, they released what was a pretty daring album for the time, a record called Age of Consent. They chose that title because in the liner notes were all the ages of consent for homosexual acts in several countries in Europe, including the UK. For the record, in Britain, you could legally have straight sex at 16, but if you were gay, sex was illegal under the age of 21. The songs were mini vignettes from Jimmy's experiences growing up gay in small, conservative, intolerant, homophobic parts of the country. The first single and its powerful video were major eye-openers for a lot of people around the world. At the same time the Bronski Beat was trying to make their point, the AIDS epidemic was just starting to be felt. By the mid-1980s, they were calling it AIDS. That was its name by the mid-1980s, AIDS, instead of its original name, GRID, which stood for Gay-Related Immune Deficiency. The battle against AIDS drew all kinds of attention to the gay community because once you were diagnosed and got sick, it was pretty hard to hide it. And of course, once the scope of the epidemic became apparent, people began to fight back against the disease, and back against the straight world's initial antipathy about AIDS. The first famous person to die of AIDS was actor Rock Hudson, who kept his true sexuality hidden for decades. He died on October the 3rd, 1985. 9 days after that, the first famous musician died of the disease. Ricky Wilson was one of 2 gay members of the B-52s, the other being singer Fred Schneider. Ricky began to feel ill sometime in 1983, and by early 1985 he was very sick, suffering from Kaposi sarcoma and various infections, and he had bouts of pneumonia. Ricky was so sick that he found it impossible to make it through the sessions for a new B-52s album called Bouncing Off Satellites. But because of the stigma surrounding AIDS patients, Ricky kept quiet, kept everything to himself. In fact, Ricky's sister, Cindy Wilson, who was one of the singers in the B-52s, didn't find out her brother had AIDS until October the 9th, 1985, just 3 days before Ricky died. Ricky passed away on October 12th at the Sloan Kettering Hospital in New York. He was 32 and the first notable musician to die of AIDS. Here's a sample of one of the last songs Ricky recorded with the B-52s. It's from Bouncing Off Satellites, which was released 11 months after he died. This is called Summer of Love. There were a number of gay or allegedly or apparently gay groups to enter the mainstream in the 1980s. There was the Pet Shop Boys. There was Dead or Alive featuring their cross-dressing singer Pete Byrne. There was Culture Club, of course, with Boy George out front. There was Divine, a 300-pound drag queen who crossed over from making movies with cult king John Waters to having several club hits, some of which made it to radio. And then there was Erasure. Like Soft Cell, they were a two-man group consisting of songwriter Vince Clarke, who back in the late 70s was a founding member of Depeche Mode, and the singer, the openly gay Andy Bell. Erasure specialized in a happy, campy, bouncy sound and a happy, campy, bouncy image. And in the late 1980s, they had a string of hits, most of which have become staples at any retro 80s party.
How can I explain when there are few words I can choose? How can I explain when words get broken?
Chains of Love from Erasure. Watch for a book on singer Andy Bell, who discovered he was HIV positive when he got sick on a trip to Spain back in 1998. The good news is that the treatments are working very well and that he's feeling very good. His biggest challenge to date has been a couple of hip replacement surgeries. Not all music made by gay people in the 1980s was bouncy, campy, and synthesizer-driven. Some of the toughest punk rock came from a gay or partially gay source. In fact, one of the most influential hardcore punk bands of all time had a singer who was very, very, very gay. That's next.
This is the ongoing history of new music. You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music.
There were two bands who really helped set the agenda for alternative rock in America in the 1980s. Each group was highly influential in its own way and changed the course of alt-rock forever. And it just so happens that the leaders of both groups are gay. Let's start with Husker Du. They were a trio, and in fact, 2/3 of the band was gay, although that part of the group's resume was kept quiet for years. There was singer and guitarist Bob Mould and drummer Grant Hart. Husker Du was based out of all places, Minneapolis. Husker Du took the speed and the volume of hardcore punk and mated it with the more traditional song structures and melody. Their sound and their approach reverberated everywhere, including up in the Pacific Northwest, where this new thing called grunge was starting to come together. The sound also hit home on the East Coast around Boston, where groups like the Pixies took their cues. That's part one. Part two had to do with the way Husker Du conducted business. In the beginning, they, like just about every other alternative band in America, were signed to an independent label. Back then, major labels were considered poison, and anyone who signed to a major was risking losing all their credibility and integrity with their audience. But Husker Du managed to do it. After 5 indie albums, Husker Du made the jump to a major label in 1987, and much to the surprise of the purists, nothing happened to the group's sound or creativity. So, why is this a big deal? Because Husker Du proved that you could be every bit as vital and every bit as creative on a major label. Signing with a major no longer meant selling out. It meant that a band like Husker Du could now benefit from the distribution support and the relative security that came with being on a major. If you've never heard Husker Du before, check this out. And so much for gay guys not being able to slam dance with the best of them, huh?
Walking around with your head in the clouds, it makes no sense at all. So you're so short, but you're walking so tall, it makes no sense at all. Is it important to yelling so loud? It makes no sense at all. Walking around with your head in the clouds makes no difference at all. Yeah, it makes no sense at all. Makes no difference at all. Well, I don't know why you wanna tell me when I'm right or when I'm wrong. It's the same thing in your mind. The only time I'm right is when I play along. When I play along. Walking around with your head in the clouds, it makes no sense at all. So you're so short, but you're walking so tall, it makes no sense at all. Is it important you're yelling so loud? It makes no sense at all. Walking around with your head in the clouds makes no difference at all. Yeah, it makes no sense at all. Makes no difference at all. You concern yourself with evidence. It's evident to me. When you say you've got the tiger by the tail, but I don't see these things that way. See these things that way. Walking around with your head in the clouds, it makes no sense at all. So you're so short, but you're walking so tall, it makes no sense at all. Is it important you're yelling so loud? It makes no sense at all. Walking around with your head in the clouds makes no difference at all. Yeah, makes no sense at all. Makes no difference at all. Walking around with your head in the clouds, it makes no sense at all.
Husker Du from 1984 makes no sense at all from an album called Flip Your Wig. Husker Du officially broke up on December 17th, 1987. What fans didn't know was that Bob Mould and Grant Hart were actually lovers. The band broke up because they did. Bob is now very open about his sexuality and continues to work as a solo artist. Oh, and have you ever watched The Daily Show with Jon Stewart? You know who wrote the theme song for that? Yeah, Bob Mould. The other group who showed everyone the advantages of signing to a major label was R.E.M. They began their career on an indie label called IRS, but like Husker Du and so many other alternative bands at the time, they grew tired of the grind and the hassles that came with being signed to an indie. That's why they also jumped to Warner Brothers in the middle 1980s. And like Husker Du before them, and like Sonic Youth and Nirvana and a ton of others afterwards, REM showed the alt-rock community that signing with a major label didn't mean signing away your integrity. And I guess we don't have to go into how influential REM was through the 80s and early 90s, do we? Now, for a number of years, everybody suspected that Michael Stipe was gay, and he quietly came out years ago, but he chooses to be extremely private about his personal life, something for which he makes absolutely no apologies.
This one goes out to the one I love. This one goes out to the one I've left behind. A simple prop to occupy my time. This one goes out to the one I love. Fire! This one goes out to the one I love. This one goes out to the one I've left behind. A simple prop to occupy my time. This one goes out to the one I love. Fire! This one goes out to the one I love. This one goes out to the one I've left behind. Another prop has occupied my time. This one goes out to the one I love.
REM with The One I Love from their Document album back in 1987. Here's another gay milestone that involves alt-rock bands. Earlier, we talked about how Ricky Wilson of the B-52s became the world's first notable musician to die of AIDS. Here's something a lot happier. Before she went solo and got into acting, Bjork was a member of a band called the Sugar Cubes. They were based out of Iceland, which, from all reports, is a pretty progressive place. Einar, one of the singers, and Bragi, the bass player, got married in 1989, making them the first rock performers in the world to have an open, same-sex marriage. 1989. And you thought Canada was leading the way on this one.
No place to stop. Meet Johnny.
Train from in my life, moon and sun in my life, lobster and shrimps in my life. I don't really like lobster.
Regina is too old, but the sun is much older. Still the sun with white tears, but Mrs. R with none. Sun with false tears. Give me lobster and fish.
I really don't like lobster.
The Sugar Cubes with a song called Regina from 1989. In just a second, we'll finish things up with a look at groups that are not only gay, but militantly so. Hold on.
You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music. This is the ongoing history of new music.
Let's wrap things up with a quick look at how gay new rock progressed through the 1990s and into the 21st century. Once the 90s began, things began to really open up. For the first time since the early 80s, performers once again began to use gay imagery to actually promote and enhance their personal image. Just look at a guy like, Marilyn Manson. And if you've ever read anything about Nirvana, you know that Kurt Cobain was very pro-gay and very anti-homophobia. You might find this interesting, too. In 1993, Kurt Cobain gave an interview to the gay magazine The Advocate. Here's a quote. "I'm definitely gay in spirit. If I hadn't found Courtney, I probably would have carried on a bisexual lifestyle." That's from Kurt Cobain. Earlier in the show, we talked about Husker Du's hardcore contributions. One of their legacies is a branch of alt-rock called queercore, or homocore. Queercore is sexually charged punk that wears its gayness as a badge of honor. The songs are aggressive and intense, very honest and very proud. Queercore groups include San Francisco's Pansy Division. There's Extra Fancy, who were out of Los Angeles and led by Stephen Grillo, one of the first openly gay men to lead an alternative rock band. And then there's God Is My Co-Pilot, who are from New York. They're led by an openly bisexual husband and wife team. And let me play you this. These are the Queers. They're from, believe it or not, New Hampshire. And this is from 1998. It's called The Sun Always Shines Around You.
Oh, how I wish and hope it's true that you know I'm in love with you. 'Cause you seem to have forgotten I exist. And do you even remember that we kissed? And I'm wondering what you're thinking of me. Silly words we didn't mean, hot and cold and in between.
The Queers, with The Sun Always Shines Around You. Another branch of the queercore movement is the lesbian side of the riot girl scene. This is almost an entire program in itself. For example, did you know that one of the founding members of the whole riot girl scene was a Canadian group? Fifth Column came out of Toronto in the very early 1980s and were intensely committed not only to women's rights and feminist principles, but also lesbian issues. They predated the riot girl scene of the Pacific Northwest by years. They were founded by Gloria Berlin-Jones, the creator of a fanzine aimed at gays and transvestites. Using the magazine as a propaganda tool, Jones established what she called the Bitch Nation. Punk dykes, girl gangs, whatever it took. Later, another Canadian band, Vancouver's Mecca Normal, helped establish the riot girl scene using Fifth Column's guiding principles. And I guess we better define riot girl now, huh? This is a brand of loud and aggressive and raw feminist punk rock that emerged out of the same stew as grunge in the early 1990s. It was headquartered around Portland, Oregon, and Olympia, Washington. Now, not all riot girl groups concern themselves with lesbian issues and the issues of sexuality, but many do. There's 7 Year Bitch, Bikini Kill, Sleater Kinney, and Bratmobile. The spiritual leader and godmother of the lesbian side of the riot girl scene is Donna Dresch, the head of a group called Team Dresch. Check out the lyrics for this one. This is a 1996 track called Uncle Frank. A fine example of lesbian riot girl rock, Team Dresch and Uncle Frank. The album is called Captain My Captain from 1996. These days, in the era of Ellen DeGeneres and Will and Grace and Queer Eye for the Straight Guy and Angels in America and Hedwig of the Angry Inch, being openly gay isn't that big a deal, especially for alt-rock and new rock musicians. Now, one of the big scandals of 2003 was T2, a Russian group supposedly made up of 2 underage lesbians. But people were outraged because they were underage, not because they were lesbians. One of the big stories of 2004 was the Scissor Sisters, who make no apologies about their gayness and had the #1 album in the UK in 2004. Then there's Tegan and Sarah, twin sisters from Calgary, who both happen to be gay. Their music has attracted some great reviews from all over the world. And let me play you something from a group called Magnetic Fields, a mixed sexuality group led by singer Stephen Merritt, who is gay. This is from a 2004 album called I, and it's called that because all the songs start with the letter I. This is I Thought You Were My Boyfriend.
You told me you loved me, unaware and when. Come sunrise, surprise, surprise, the joke's on me again. I know you don't love me, you know I don't care. Keep it hidden, better did I say the world was fair. I thought I was just a guy for you and it would never end. I thought we were supposed to be like glue. I thought you were my boyfriend. I thought you were my boyfriend. Love or not, I've always got 10 guys on whom I can depend. And if you're not mine, 1 less is 9. Get wise, I thought you were my boyfriend. I thought you were my boyfriend. I just hope you're happy, stringing me along. While you're stringing, I'm here singing, it's my saddest song. I wish I could see you, I wish I could sleep. Should I freak out? Should I seek out someone I could keep? I thought I was just a guy for you and it would never end. I thought we were supposed to be like glue. I thought you were my boyfriend. I thought you were my boyfriend. Love or not, I've always got 10 guys on whom I can depend. And if you're not mine, 1 less is 9. Get wise, I thought you were my boyfriend. I thought you were my boyfriend.
Stephen Merritt and his band Magnetic Fields. The song is I Thought You Were My Boyfriend. Back in a moment.
You're tuned to the ongoing history of new music. This is the ongoing history of new music.
It wasn't all that long ago that if you were gay, you had to keep it to yourself. Coming out meant familial, social, and career suicide. Not anymore. In fact, there is some serious academic study on how sexuality has affected music throughout the ages. Nadine Hubbs, a professor of music and women's studies at the University of Michigan, has a book called The Queer Composition of America's Sound. She says that many of America's biggest classical composers, from Leonard Bernstein to Aaron Copland, were not only gay, but that their gayness can be heard in their music. On a semi-related note, researchers from the University of Minnesota and Northwestern University published a study in 2004 that suggests there was such a thing as a gay accent. Forget gaydar. This study suggests that you can spot a gay person just by the way they form their words when they talk. Could this apply to singing? Who knows? And really, come on, is it important? Well, okay, maybe to some people. These last 2 shows are far from being the definitive history of gay rock. You could write a very thick book on that subject. The goal here was to show how gay culture has not only seeped into the mainstream via new rock, but how it has also influenced the course of history of what we call alternative rock. Hope it was in some way enlightening. Hope you enjoyed it. Technical production for all this is by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.
You've been listening to The Ongoing History of New Music, a Deep Sky production.